Thank you, everyone, for joining the Infrastructure Buildings Working Group meeting number 42. We've been running these meetings for now over 10 years as part of the NRCan adaptation platform. My name is Dan Sandink. I co-chair this group with Chad Nelson from Housing Infrastructure Communities Canada, and Anna Murphy has been very helpful as our manager and support for this group. I'm just going to do a bit of logistics here, and then I'm going to pass it over to Chad. So first, if you wouldn't mind, you could turn your camera on, give a wave so we know who's here in the first couple of minutes. And otherwise, if you wouldn't mind keeping yourself muted throughout the meeting, enter your comments into the chat throughout the discussion, throughout the presentations, and we'll make sure we get to them after the presentations during discussion session. Raise your hand or turn your camera on, unmute yourself. We'd like to hear from whoever would like to have a question or comment, but otherwise keep yourself muted, please. We are recording the meeting, and we will be posting the meeting on an unlisted YouTube channel. So everybody will have access to that after we've completed the meeting, usually within a day or two. Thanks very much to new members. So we've got a really good group here today. A few dozen people have signed up to attend. We want to remind people that this is an open platform, open meeting. If there's anybody you'd like to invite to future meetings, please do so. We also invite anybody on this group to connect with Anna, Chad, or myself with topics for future meetings. If you have a project that you would like to get in front of this audience, if you know of important projects in the area of adaptation and climate resilience for infrastructure buildings that you think should be in front of this audience, please let us know. We're more than happy to find a way to get everybody's work out there in the field. Also, please use this opportunity to notify this group of any projects, workshops, upcoming initiatives that you would like to broadcast through this group. Use the chat, put any information you like in there, websites, registration links, whatever you like. So everyone on this group will see it, but we'll also prepare a summary note that will go out to the full list of IBWG members, which is well over, I think, close to about 150 people. If you have anything you'd like to share, please put it in the chat, and we'll make sure that gets out to the group. And pardon me, we will have one last request before I pass it over to Chad. We have been assembling over the past few months what we'd like to put out as a public registry of participants in the Infrastructure Buildings Working Group, and that's meant to sort of provide a resource to people working in this area, so we can sort of connect with people working in similar fields, or if there's expertise that you're looking for, we'll have an online resource that people can turn to. Since we have such a large group, we'd like to populate this with as many people as possible. Anna will share a link to a form, and please take the time to fill that out, and we will eventually publish this list as part of our ongoing activities. And once again, thanks for joining, and I'm going to pass it over to Chad.
Okay, thank you, Dan, and really appreciate that. And what a pleasure it is to co-chair this group with you, and we're working with Anna as our manager coordinator. So as Dan said, I come from Housing Infrastructure and Communities Canada. And in case you've wondered what call you've dialed into, I thought maybe it'd be useful to provide a little more context. So under the National Adaptation Platform, which is run by Natural Resources Canada, there are a series of working groups. And this one, I understand, I believe is probably the largest one of the working groups in which we exchange leading practices from across the country related to resilience, or adaptation, infrastructure, and buildings. And it's great to have a diverse membership from provinces and territories, federal government, but also practitioners, nonprofits, academics, other sectors involved in what is really a collective challenge for society as we really look to living in an altered climate and the challenges that presents. I wanted to mention that the platform itself is going through a bit of a change, and there's an electronic platform that NRCan has created, and we will keep you posted about the increased functionality that will soon be available online associated with the Infrastructure and Buildings Working Group, held under the auspices of the National Adaptation Platform. I have a couple announcements to share before we turn to, I'll turn it back to Dan to introduce our first speaker. The first announcement relates to climatedata.ca. For those who have not yet heard, there was the recent release of future building design value summaries. And this reflects work that you may have seen us present previously to this group from the National Research Council. What it reflects is tailored climate-adjusted design values for over 660 Canadian locations. And it's formatted in really easy-to-use tables that mirror the layout of Table C2 in the National Building Code. So these one-page summaries were really designed by climatedata.ca and our friends at Environment Climate Change Canada's Canadian Centre for Climate Services, along with the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium, to be data easily used by architects, engineers, and others in getting these specifications, and indeed are going to link to the Design Value Explorer of PCIC. The links will be pasted in the chat, hopefully by Anna, and noted in our meeting notes. These can be really helpful as we look to the future. How hot, wet, rainy precipitation will it be, as opposed to looking at outdated values in the design and planned operation of infrastructure assets. The second announcement is to mention, to share with this group, that the 2026 Adaptation Canada Conference is now accepting applications to host the third version of Canada's National Conference on Climate Change and Adaptation. I believe they're looking in Toronto in the fall of 2026. And so ECCC is accepting applications in this regard for designing, hosting, organizing the conference. And the submission end date is October 21st. It really will be an important opportunity to bring together a wide array of orders of government, Indigenous peoples, non-governmental organizations, private sector, industry, and academia to share best practices. Sounds a lot like what IBWG serves to do. So there'll be more details will be provided. Again, information in our meeting notes and links here in the chat, but you can visit the GCEM's portal or contact the program. Information's in the chat and it'll be in the notes. Dan, I'm going to turn it back to you, I think, to, I have a brief moment to introduce at a high level today's presenters. So we're going to begin from hearing from the National Research Council. You're then going to hear from Public Safety Canada, and then from the British Columbia Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure. We're going to introduce these speakers as we go along. So I think I'll actually just pause there and hand it back to Dan.
Great, thanks, Chad. Thanks everyone for joining. We got a great, excellent crowd. So our first presenter, we're very happy to have Dr. Marzia Rehindzad, who's an associate research officer at NRC's Construction Research Center. Dr. Rehindzad holds a PhD in chemical engineering from the Institute for Polymer Research at the University of Waterloo. At NRC, Marzia leads the durability, resiliency, and sustainability team focusing on sustainable and resilient building envelope materials, evaluating their performance, and predicting service life. Additionally, Dr. Rehindzad heads the Resilient Residential Retrofit theme under the Climate Resilient Built Environment Initiative at NRC, which aims to enhance climate resilience in existing buildings through retrofitting. She's also adjunct professor at the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Ottawa, where she co-supervises graduate students and delivers lectures. So Dr. Rehindzad, please share your screen and go ahead.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Dan, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Marzia, and today I'm going to talk about Resilient Residential Retrofit, or as we call it, RCUBE. It's a program at a construction research center at National Research Council, Canada. So before I get into the Resilient Residential Retrofit program, I wanted to talk about Climate Resilient Built Environment Initiative that I'm sure many of you are familiar with that initiative that my colleague Marian Armstrong has been leading since 2016. And it's an ongoing partnership with Infrastructure Canada to develop science-based guidelines, research data, codes, and standards. And you can see some of the outputs as the national guides and also standards here that they are publicly available and have been adopted across Canada. The latest addition to Climate Resilient Built Environment Initiative, or CRBE, is Resilient Residential Retrofit, or RQ program that we launched last year. The funding is from National Adaptation Strategy, and the big vision that we have for RQ is to enhance the climate resiliency of existing residential buildings, meaning everywhere that people live, any type of residential building, through retrofit. What we are trying to achieve as an output through this program is to develop national guidelines, best practices, create new standards, update existing outdated standards, and make code change requests. We also look into having successful pilot studies to de-risk the applied tools and technology, and also recommended resiliency retrofit measures to facilitate their market adoption in Canada. Also build new partnership and strengthen the existing collaboration across Canada. And through that partnership, we are aiming to have knowledge dissemination to increase awareness and capacity to undertake resiliency retrofit measures. And the impact you're envisioning for this program is that we have the project outputs adopted by industry, insurance, government incentive programs, other existing resilient retrofit programs to have retrofit strategies that enable Canada to have residential buildings that are climate resilient. We are targeting vulnerable population, and our goal is to reduce the loss of life, property, and financial costs associated with the impact of climate change. So just a brief overview of the vision and goals, outputs, and impacts of RQ. In terms of what we have done so far, as I mentioned, we launched this program last year. We spent the first few months in winter 2023 to conduct a scientometric study to better understand this topic, most frequent research areas in the literature, and know the key players nationally, internationally, and also identify the existing retrofit incentive programs that exist in Canada and also at other countries around the world to better understand this space. And then we started a series of stakeholder engagement activities. Many of you have been part of that stakeholder engagement activities last year. We started with a consultation questionnaire in August, September, where we reached out to over 100 experts across Canada and asked them questions. And we used the feedback we got from that consultation, and we designed 2 workshops that happened in October and December last year. The result of this stakeholder engagement activities helped us to solidify the roadmap that we have for this program, also helped us to identify, validate, and prioritize the knowledge gaps and key research areas that we wanted to focus as National Research Council. And also for some of the projects that we had already started, it helped us to refine their scope and also define what research areas are needed and what knowledge gaps that we need that exist that we need to address. So the call for proposal was out last April. This is still ongoing, and we're still looking to meaningful collaboration and useful projects that can help us to achieve the vision that we set for this program. I wanted to take just 2 minutes to share some of the highlights from the consultation that we conducted last August and September. The full report summarizing all the results are publicly available. It's on NPARC. So just 2 key takeaways from the consultation results. So we reached out to our expert and we asked them what are the key barriers in their opinion that prevent implementation of climate resilient retrofit measures. And the first big barrier that was identified was cost. I'm sure it's not a shock to anyone. Cost comes as the most important barrier for implementation of climate resilient retrofit. And during our conversations and discussions, we had a similar thing about affordability. It came up as one of the most important concerns when it comes into when it comes to retrofit. The second key barrier was identified as knowledge about the climate risk. And this is in a multi-hazard. When we are dealing with multi-hazard in a region, we need a decision support tool to enable us to prioritize what retrofit should happen first, considering we have limited resources. And this came up as the second important barrier. And the third one was shared between time interruptions to building occupants and human behavior, human emotion during extreme climate events. We also heard very interesting feedback from our expert on other key barriers that was not in our list, such as inability if you're a renter without a support from owner, what you are going to do in terms of the retrofit, and other barriers that you can see in the list. Another question that we asked is that we put 5 important research forecasts that in our mind was the important aspects that we at NRC has to focus on. And we asked our expert to vote on which one is the most important one for us to focus as most important research focus areas. The first vote was how to prioritize most critical risk in a given location. And again, talking about competing risk and how we need a decision support tool to know where we have to focus or prioritize our resources first. The second one, which followed closely, was how to integrate mitigation adaptation. We know that we talk about energy efficiency, low carbon, decarbonization, at the same time, climate resiliency, how we can have a holistic approach. And when we do a retrofit, we make sure we are addressing all these different aspects that come with retrofit. And the third one was how to understand compound climate risk. So when we are dealing with 2 or more risks, which is usually the case, in reality, how we can integrate all these risks together, look into the co-benefits, interrelation, and also maladaptation of different retrofit measures to make sure that when we implement a retrofit measure, we're not having unintended consequences and basically creating more issues in future. So taking all this feedback from the workshops and the consultation and many conversation meetings that we had, we came up with a roadmap that it can enable us in terms of adaptation retrofit. And we put together a flowchart. Many of you have seen that flowchart. It also exists in the report that I mentioned on AirPark. I don't have the time to go through the flowchart, but just a very high level overview of the proposed roadmap to enable adaptation retrofit. The first and foremost step is having access to publicly available tools that help us with hazard and exposure mapping, so we can find out what are the pressing hazards and the degree of exposure at different regions across Canada. The second one is building an occupant assessment and vulnerability identification, looking to building system and occupant vulnerability to assess risk based on the degree of exposure, consequence of that climate event, and vulnerability of the occupant. The third step is identification adaptation measures, having access to kind of a database with all the existing available adaptation measures so we can pick and select based on our needs from that list, which is actually something that we're working on. The next step would be evaluating that adaptation measure. So what are the different aspects of the adaptation measure in terms of client budget, GHG emission and sustainability, energy efficiency, return on investment, like cost benefit analysis, all these types of factors that can help us to narrow down to the one that is working the best in our case. And implementing the adaptation measure, ideally starting with demonstration projects, some pilot project to like confirm the efficiency of that retrofit strategy. And last but not least, which came up a lot during our consultation and workshops, is increased public awareness and capacity through outreach and education, which is knowledge mobilization. So in terms of the research that we are conducting at the time at National Research Council, we've tried to narrow down or focus on the most important and pressing and relevant climate risk for Canada. So we are focusing on extreme wind, permafrost melt, extreme heat, flooding, wildfire, and wildfire smoke. So these are the areas that we are focusing on the R-Cube at the moment. And in the rest of my presentation, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to present each of these projects that are ongoing under R-Cube. So just giving you a brief overview of what's happening in the research project, what's the objective, who are the collaborators, so you are familiar with that. And I know it's a very short introduction, so if you are interested to learn more about any of the projects, you have questions, you wanted to collaborate, please reach out to me, Marla, or Marianne, so we can connect you to the technical lead for that project for more discussions. So the first project, which is basically a more encompassing project under R-Cube that has a multi-hazard approach, is development and a cost-benefit analysis of residential building envelope retrofit packages. So for this project, we are working with University of Waterloo Partners for Action and CMHC, and our objectives is to develop a database of climate adaptation measures for envelope retrofit. So Partners for Action at the University of Waterloo had already put together a database, and they put forward a contract with them to further develop their database and make it publicly available, which is actually we halfway through the work, and it's going very well. So at the end of that, we wanted to have a database that is publicly available and have all the adaptation measures based on different climate hazards and look into the maladaptation co-benefits. So the next step would be identifying municipalities that are at greatest risk and create representative archetype, and then analyze operational cost and performance of those archetypes under the scenario that there is no retrofit is happening. So we have an established baseline, and then identify the magnitude of the risk and their impact, and then perform cost-benefit analysis on the envelope retrofit packages to address the multiple climate risks. The next three projects that I'm going to talk about, they're focusing on overheating, but they're looking at overheating and extreme heat from different angles. The first project is Resilient Sustainable Retrofit Solution to Mitigate Overheating. For this project, we spent several months to investigate the resilient and sustainable retrofit strategies for residential buildings. We looked into both active and passive measures, and also looked into the resilient measures in terms of carbon emission and sustainability too. So we selected 6 retrofit strategies that they have potential to be adopted in Canada, considering Canadian climate, and also they have low GHG emissions. So we are currently performing energy simulations for those selected technologies that you can see in this figure, and considering they are applied to different types of residential buildings, from MERBs to row house single family homes, under both long-term and short-term extreme heat events. And we are currently working on finding partners for field demonstration in collaboration with the partners in different cities across Canada to de-risk those technologies and creating a guideline for their market development. So that's the objectives of this project. We're still looking into partners. If this is something that interests you, please let me know, and we would love to have more discussions with you on that. For the second project on overheating, again, we are focusing on the overheating, but the angle that we are looking at, it's vulnerable population. So we're focusing on social houses, and this is in collaboration with BC Housing. So far, 3 social houses located in BC were selected for this project. They had no central mechanical cooling, and we assessed their indoor overheating events in these units. So we collect hourly temperature, relative humidity, and carbon dioxide data. This data will be transferred securely to NRC, and we use machine learning models for each unit to predict the indoor temperature 24 hours ahead. So basically developing an early heat warning tool. And then we look into several passive retrofit scenarios using simulation modeling. And for those retrofit scenarios, we look into the impact of those retrofits on indoor overheating, also annual energy usage and GHG emission, looking into all these three aspects together to see which retrofit options would be the most effective one. And based on that, writing a report or guideline on recommended retrofit scenarios to mitigate overheating. For the third project on overheating, we look at overheating issue when there is wildfire happening outside. So basically investigating and mitigating the impact of wildfire smoke and overheating or extreme heat on indoor environment quality, IEQ, and health and safety of the occupant. So far we have done a field study to collect IEQ data and occupant health info. We had site visits to 3 long-term care facilities in Montreal, also looking into 1 long-term facility in Sherbrooke, and also looking into different active and passive retrofit measures such as natural ventilation or air purifier or other retrofit options, and looking into their efficiency. So quantifying the impact of those retrofit interventions or the retrofit measures on IEQ and occupant health. We demonstrate those intervention strategies first in NRC facilities and then implement them in the selected buildings, and also generalizing the result to other climate zones, because like we have selected units that we can do this retrofit. So we wanted to generalize the result through other climate zones and also future climate scenarios through simulation and data-driven modeling. And also the last step for this project is to conduct a cost-benefit analysis for those intervention strategies and update the existing standards and guidelines on that. The next project is focusing on wildfire. You're probably familiar with Wildland Urban Interface or WUI guide from NRC. And that WUI guide is focused on residential buildings that are basically the new builds, right? So to make those new builds more fire resistant. It doesn't take into account the design specification of existing residential buildings and the fact that if they're meeting the wildfire resiliency recommendations in WUI guideline or not. So that's why this project was born. And some of the researchers from that developed the WUI guideline work on this project to assess the design of existing residential buildings in select Canadian cities and identify their wildfire resiliency, then identify recommended construction classes of buildings under past, present, and future project climates. And if there is an upgrade that is needed, the level of upgrade will be identified, and also a cost-benefit analysis will be conducted for that retrofit. For this project, we're working with our Ocean, Coastal, and River Engineering Research Center on flooding resiliency retrofit in residential buildings. So far, what has been done is that we selected a sample of residential buildings in flood-prone areas and conducted evaluation on the effectiveness of various retrofit solutions. And now we're focusing on updating the CSA Z800 guideline on baseline flood protection, also developing a CSA standard for emergency flood barriers. We test the performance of opening barriers in our OCRI Research Center, and also look into the return on investment from flood resiliency retrofit measure. The next project is on permafrost melt and permafrost thaw in northern communities. So we are focusing on the northern housing. For this project, currently we are studying it's a scoping study project. No experiment is involved at the moment, but it's studying the current condition of aging foundation system in residential buildings in Northwestern Territory and define the permafrost foundation performance under climate change condition, and also looking into best practices for foundation assessment, effective monitoring system, and retrofit techniques based on community engagement. We had a workshop at the International Conference on Permafrost back in June that happened in Yukon, and our technical lead for this project brought together all the leaders in this space to learn about the best practices that are happening at different climates and different countries. We also have two projects focused on balconies, but looking at balconies in residential buildings from two different angles. The first project is looking into developing a knowledge database of environmental performance, meaning improving indoor environment quality, thermal comfort, and health and well-being of the occupant, as well as behavioral performance in Canadian climate zone. So far, the researchers developed a case study database on retrofitting mere balconies, different types of retrofit based on elimination, addition, modification at different climate zones across the world in order to identify the retrofit strategies and their impact on residents. And they're planning resident survey on retrofit MERBs across Canada. And this project, the future direction for this project is to compare the retrofit strategies and cooling solution, the impact that they have on passive cooling inside the units during the extreme heat event, and also conduct pre and post retrofit studies on specific retrofit strategies and develop a guideline on that. For this project, we are also looking for partners in order to have a demonstration project or pilot project for balconies retrofit. If you have a network or you're interested, please let me know. And for this project, which is the last project I'm going to talk about today, is looking at balconies, but from serviceability, from a different lens. So we noticed that there is very little information on the performance of balconies and retrofit strategies for balconies for residential buildings in Canada. And this actually, a failure of balconies led to loss of life and injuries in Canada. So our researchers are focusing on safety, serviceability, and service life of residential balconies with respect to climate change. We know with more strong wind, freeze-thaw cycles, carbonation due to high level of deterioration due to high level of carbonation in urban areas, like more rain, all the climate events that are becoming more frequent and more aggressive. There is more pressure and there's more environmental load on balconies. So we look into understanding the existing guidelines and procedures, which exist very little, and identify the need and step to develop evaluation and testing guidelines and protocols. So currently we're developing a plan for evaluation, modeling, and testing of the balconies and updating CSA A500 standard on building guards. In terms of next step, we have a project that it's at planning stage at the moment on climate resiliency requirement for retrofit of residential roofs with asphalt shingles, focusing on wind and rain resistance of roofing products and retrofit of those, and creating a guideline. We are planning to launch this project early next fiscal year. We also have a contract with ICLR on climate resilient guideline for Canadian homes to develop technical sheets, and also we are putting together a contract with Natural Resources Canada on understanding the embedded resiliency measures and gap in National Building Code of Canada, which is basically a review of a climate consideration and potential related gaps in the previous and current versions of National Building Code, and understanding of the potential risk that those gaps could have on the existing Canadian housing stock. And I mentioned Partners for Action in one of the slides earlier. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. And yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Certainly a lot of work going on in your programs. We're looking forward to seeing the outcomes of the work. So I didn't see, please do enter your questions into the chat box. We've got a couple of minutes for questions here while people are thinking of questions, or raise your hands if you like. Marcia had two requests for additional participation that was related to field testing of overheating mitigation options. It was on slide 10, and a project related to multi-unit residential buildings and balconies on slide 16. Marcia, what type of additional partnership are you looking for? Are you looking for builders and developers to implement options? Is that the kind of?
Yeah,
okay,
exactly. Yeah. So we have for those two projects, we have our we have already collaboration with academia to basically continue the project. But what we are lacking is to have a builder renovator who's willing to work with us on a case study, on a pilot project. And I have already been in touch with some of the people present in the call, and they referred us to some of the builders and renovators, but we still need more case studies.
right. That's good to know. I'm not sure if we have any builders and renovators on the line here, but perhaps through some of the consulting companies, we can make some linkages. Oh, sorry, Frank Lohan.
Yeah. Hi, Marcia.
Hi, Frank.
Thank you. If you can send me immediately exactly where you need. I thought I had updated that we're about to launch a newsletter to our members if it's not already out. But if you give me the information right away as to what the projects are and what you need in terms of, I can add that with a short blurb of explanation.
Okay. Thank you so much. I will do that today.
Okay, great. I don't see any other hands up or comments here.
I see questions in the chat.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say in the chat, I see Sahar Safei is saying, thanks, Marcia. Are the social and health benefits considered in the cost benefit analysis? If yes, could you please explain a bit how it is approached? Then there's a question from Stephanie as well.
Yeah. So we have cost benefit analysis in multiple projects, and social and health is part of that. We are this step is basically at the end of our projects. We are not there yet, so I don't have any established approach to share with you, Sahar. But if you have any suggestions, please let me know. So we have this step in multiple projects at the very end, so we are not there yet. Yeah, so I don't have any refined or established protocol that I can share with you at the moment. Yeah, but that's a great question. And Stephanie, thank you. So you already connected us to your contacts for demonstration projects. So Jimmy and I met with your network, and but we are looking for more locations to have more case studies. I can ask Jimmy on what other locations he's looking into it, and I get in touch with you.
Okay, great. One additional question. So I see Steph's and Sahar's questions been answered. One last question, I suppose, before we have to move on. So you mentioned earlier on sort of a flow chart of needs for moving on resilience. And I think one of the initial needs was understanding the hazards and resilience options, and you mentioned something about developing a decision support system. Is this an ongoing project? Could you describe that a little bit more?
This is not something that we do at NRC. This is like a kind of a proposed roadmap that we need to follow too. So for many of those pieces, we rely on our partners, for example, knowledge dissemination. I know that there are some works that are happening at the moment for a national hazard and exposure mapping. You know, Dan, you're on the you're involved in one of those projects. So some of this work is happening, and this is a very early first step to know if you wanted to look at the multiple hazards, what are the locations that are at greatest risk? Yeah, so for that, we are not actually, this is not something that NRC is working on. We are mainly focused on the middle steps, on the vulnerability and building system assessment, identification adaptation measures, evaluation of the adaptation measures. But in the first and last step, we are relying on our partners and collaborators.
Okay, understood. Thank you, thank you, Marzi. I think we have to move on. Unfortunately, there's lots more to talk about here, but I'm sure we'll have you back at some point in the future. So thanks again for your great presentation, and I will pass it over to Chad.
Okay, great. So our next set of speakers come from Public Safety Canada. We're really right on time, or barely 1 minute past time. So we're going to be speaking here about federal flood risk identification initiatives. And I'm very pleased to introduce Jamie Gesualdo and Julie Van de Valk from Public Safety Canada. Jamie is a senior policy advisor leading policy integration of various flood resilience initiatives. And the team has started implementing a suite of programs to further integrate flood risk management across Canada. Julie is an engineering advisor and has a water resources engineering and disaster and emergency management background with experience in public and private sectors, and she works on data analysis and policy supporting integrated flood risk management. So Jamie and Julie, over to you.
Perfect, thanks Chad. Confirming you can see my screen?
Yep.
Perfect, thanks. So I'll jump right in. Oh, sorry, I'm just gonna take those subtitles off. They always get me. Okay, there we go. Great, so just a bit of an overview of the issues at hand that I'm sure we're all very well aware of, but flooding is Canada's costliest disaster, with the average annual residential flooding costs in Canada estimating at $2.3 billion. Despite this, new risk is constantly being created, and that's with the increasing housing and infrastructure development, often in flood-prone areas. And in addition, research has shown that a significant number of Canadians located in high-risk areas are not aware that their home or property are at risk, and therefore they are exposed to those possible flooding events with potentially devastating consequences. So what is the federal government doing about this? So the government of Canada often takes a leadership role and takes action to make key contributions in the climate adaptation and risk reduction space. With this, the federal government is also working to improve coordination and program alignment across its disaster resilience programs. That's across all of government. This is also a recommendation from the expert advisory panel on the disaster financial assistance arrangement review. And also you've probably heard of these two initiatives, but the Emergency Management Strategy for Canada and the National Adaptation Action Plan and Strategy were both highlighted the need to improve the understanding of disaster risks to help develop climate resilient communities. So more specifically, and one sliver of this work that we'll go over today. So we do recognize that flood risk reduction is a joint responsibility of all levels of government. At the federal level, Public Safety Canada holds that leadership role in emergency management, keeping Canadians safe and protected, and that includes from natural hazards. With this, Public Safety is advancing several flood risk reduction initiatives. 4 main initiatives were funded under a component of the Integrated Flood Risk Management Plan, and this came out through multiple mandate letters as well as Budget 2023 and 2024. So you can see the 4 listed here. So we have the Modernized Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangements Program, flood insurance, identifying federally identified flood risk areas, and a flood risk awareness digital resource. And 3 and 4 are what we are here to talk about today. So just a quick overview. We're going to take a brief step back, explore flood mapping at the Canada-wide scale, the innovations, and specifically those innovations at Public Safety, and the accompanying use cases of those different types of maps. Then we're going to dive right into the federally identified flood risk areas, and kind of go over an overview, how it came to be and how it can be used. And finally, we'll touch on how this identification can be shared and communicated. So I'll pass it over to Julie.
Thanks, Jamie. I think we are all very much in agreement that flood mapping improves the overall understanding of flood risk and flood management response. By no means does creating a flood map solve the problem, but it's a really important first step. And the current flood mapping landscape in Canada includes two main types of flood mapping. We are probably all very familiar with your typical engineering flood maps in Canada. They are what we've looked at historically. They use high resolution input data. They really consider regional hydrology and local hydraulic features, and they produce maps of relatively high accuracy and precision. They're the type of things that you use for engineering design or to plan a community around. On the other hand, we have more emerging global modeling and mapping, and these are becoming more accessible. They're lower resolution, typically around 30 meters, although higher are also available in some locations. And they look at pluvial, fluvial, and coastal flooding. They typically provide depth and extents for a variety of return periods, but they're relatively low accuracy and precision. So not something you would at all use for site-specific engineering design or considerations or land use planning, really. At Public Safety, we purchased several limited distribution Canada-wide models back in 2020, and we've been using them for flood risk assessments and analysis. Fast forward, this past year, we closed a competitive bid process which procured a Canada-wide model with limited sharing capabilities, but there are some enhanced capabilities there. And in the coming years, Public Safety is we've already started building a Canada-wide model with academic partners that will be fully open source. So what types of things can we use these Canada-wide flood hazard models for? Well, one thing we can do is start to get some understanding of pluvial flood risk in Canada. Again, this is just a screening or high-level assessment, and site-specific conditions are really not necessarily accurately represented with these Canada-wide tools. But we can look at general trends of distribution of flood risk across the country, answering questions such as the portion of Canadian homes at risk, what sort of trends are there in geographic locations, rural, urban. We can take a look at how this may be connected with social vulnerability indicators as well. We can start asking and answering questions about the impacts of climate change and development. We can look at consistent scenarios all the way across the country. And we can do things like create an aggregation of this data that allows for kind of screening style ratings to be provided across the country.
And that screening leads us to the FIFRA. So that's the Federally Identified Flood Risk Areas. And this initiative as a whole seeks to identify high-risk areas across Canada that would ultimately require additional risk assessment or minimum mitigation levels to secure federal investments. So there are two steps or two components of the FIFRA initiative. We have the FIFRA data layer, which will identify a flood risk rating that will range from low to extreme and will be publicly communicated through that flood risk awareness digital resource. The goal of this data layer is really to, like I said, identify the potential need for further site-specific analysis or risk management measures. And then second, following that data layer rating, so based on that rating, the FIFRA program will provide a decision support tool, including a mitigation guideline. And this will really help guide the potential federal infrastructure investments and identify the appropriate mitigation conditions. So really the aim of the FIFRA program would be to create that clear yet flexible guideline. This will contain a balance of performance-based objectives, prescription requirements designed to provide that clear direction and guidance that can be adjusted to meet different scales, different complexities, and different natures of projects. Next, we just wanted to speak to some of those underlying principles of the FIFRA data layer. So we'll go into the data layer first, and then we'll speak to the program. So as it is a national tool, it obviously needs to include Canada-wide coverage. It does need to incorporate and include a full range of flood scenarios and return periods, often ones that are created consistently and widely for every location in Canada. We want to ensure that the data can be presented in a fashion that is appropriate for public communication and also for screening projects. And finally, that data layer needs to be capable of being aggregated into ratings to account for possible uncertainty, and which really does allow for the appropriate purposes, which is, like we're saying, screening federal investments. So I'll hand it back over to Julie to talk about how it was created.
Yeah, it's been quite a process to create this data layer, as you can imagine, and it is still in progress. And we started with a multiple-year process of getting to know those Canada-wide flood hazard models. And finally, we are working through QA/QC of the model that I mentioned, that stage 1 model that we purchased this year. Simultaneously, we've also done a significant amount of methodology research. So looking at how a product like this could be created, what are international best practices, where can we align it with other similar projects in Canada. And through that research, we landed on a matrix-based approach. And that has led to quite a bit of further analysis that we're doing, iterating that matrix and really getting to understand it. A little bit more about that matrix approach. It combines depth and probability to create a risk rating. So you can see here, there's an example matrix that's used in Switzerland for risk management. They actually use this across multiple hazards, a similar idea. But generally speaking, the idea of the matrix is to consider the intensities from multiple return periods and combine some of our understanding about the impacts of possibly relatively small but high probability events and relatively large but low probability events, and try to balance where those are designated as high or extreme risk versus low risk. It's used internationally for other hazards such as landslides and increasingly avalanches, and it really is a great tool for screening purposes. And our goal with it is to reduce the risk of unmitigated federal investments in high and extreme risk areas. That goal connects in with the policy work that Jamie is mentioning. And overall, we're quite excited about it because it doesn't reduce the complex input flood hazard data to a simply in or out of a given floodplain. It's a more probabilistic approach that looks at the range of likelihoods of scenarios and does consider the magnitude, in this case, through depth at those different scenarios. Here's just an example of what it could look like. This is actually not at all our finished product, but this gives you an example of what it might look like in an area that has some flood exposure.
Perfect. So once we have those risk ratings, like I had mentioned, we'll move into the FIFRA program side, which will really guide those federal investment decisions and support the uptake of resilience guidelines through identifying that appropriate mitigation conditions in the risk tolerances that federal investments would be required to adhere to receive federal funding. So this guideline is currently in development. But some of the underlying principles of that guideline are seen on the screen here. So it will provide a federal minimum standard level of protection, as this is something that's currently inconsistent or unavailable throughout all of Canada. It should be considering provincial, territorial, Indigenous, or local contexts where applicable. It does need to account for mitigation concepts such as design life, reasonability, return on investment, performance-based design, and/or criticality. It does need to include relevant aspects of existing federal guidelines, building codes, and standards where applicable. And it does need to consider how it will be applied on the ground and consider how to streamline, simplify, or avoid adding, much more work to the high level of work that these federal programs already go through. So with this in mind, these are just some examples of the use cases of the FIFRA initiative as a whole. Some of it might only use the data layer, some of them might use both the data layer and the subsequent program. So we have that flood risk awareness digital resource. So that's how we are publicly communicating those risk ratings. And I will actually dive into that on the next slide. The FIFRA will support federal infrastructure programming. This is really to help establish that climate resilience and mitigation requirements across new infrastructure funding programs. It could be incorporated into the DFAA within its existing provision of limiting eligibility of unmitigated structures in flood risk areas, which would be as per designated or identified areas at any level of government. And at the federal level, we could have something like PSPC could integrate the FIFRA within their building management plans or asset management plans to really help promote understanding of flood risk and encourage mitigation actions on federal buildings. So finally, now that we have the FIFRA data and we have the program, how do we actually take those model risk ratings on that very fun, colorful image and create a product that is actually useful for the public and can be publicly disseminated? So this list to the side includes the requirements of doing something like that, and really goes to incorporating transparency, following appropriate communication practices that really can meet the needs of the audience, allows for the use of clear and concise messaging, is scalable potentially to other hazards, and really does invoke that behavioral change. So that brings us to the second part, which is the flood risk awareness digital resource. So this is something that is also in development currently. And this resource really is striving to be designed to provide comprehensive and accessible flood hazard and risk information. And this is something that can be used and understood by all Canadians. So the ratings on this resource, which is the FIFRA, will be much simpler to understand by the general public versus an engineering flood map. Like, it will be much more publicly digestible. In addition to actually showing that risk rating, it will also include knowledge, guidance, tools, and resources to help the public make informed decisions about flood risk. And also knowing that those global models that the FIFRA is based on and engineering maps that are really used at the local scale can actually work very well together in some cases. The portal plans to link the digital resources plan to link to the flood mapping inventory, and this will really help identify, well, that inventory already does identify areas in Canada where a flood hazard map has been collected by Natural Resources Canada. So we're just going to be helping making that link with the risk ratings and the actual engineered maps. To the right, you can see, again, this is not what the portal will look like. This is an existing portal in the US, but it's something like you're providing that risk rating and then also having that supplementary information that the user can go and explore. And finally, just on that last bullet, we just wanted to provide a little overview to display that interconnectedness between Canada's flood mapping inventory and that flood risk awareness digital resource. So as you can see, the portal really focuses on the general public. Some of those resources may, gear up to the curious public, but the flood mapping inventory is really a tool for specialized and ultra specialized audience who can really understand and use those engineering local maps versus just having a risk rating. Finally, just kind of a look at our timelines. So many of these initiatives and steps towards our final product are underway right now. We are hoping to have a launch of that digital resource in the FIFRA in 2025. And all things are pointing to yes. So right now we're really just focusing on the data and the program specifics and building that digital resource. So yeah, that's pretty much it from our side. I guess, Chad, I'll pass it over to you.
Sure. So thank you very much, Jamie and Julie. That's terrifically informative for the members of IBWG. I see there's already one question. Oh, and it just disappeared at my chat screen to be tackled here. And I guess actually, Julie, you've answered that question, but I was differentiating FIFRA and Flood Hazard Identification Mapping Program. The response from Julie, I'll just say, I'll read out loud for other folks. The great question. The FIMP program partners with provinces and territories to fund creation of those high accuracy engineering, in some cases regional maps of high risk areas. These maps will not cover all areas of Canada, especially rural, and they are not necessarily consistent between different locations. The FIFRA fills the gaps between these local engineering maps for screening purposes, provides consistent understanding of flood risk across the country. Okay, just because I think that might have been of interest to others, I wanted to read that out. We have a few moments here if there are questions after that presentation. I sure enjoy the mixture, I must say, of presenting the risk, but presenting agency. And I think those of us involved in the resilient infrastructure adaptation game, it's really important that we talk about not just understanding hazards and risks, but understanding the actions that can be taken. I am going to look here to the folks, if there's any hands coming up. They're not appearing on my screen just yet, but I know we have a lot of people very active in this game. I have one question, maybe other people come forward. In terms of the dynamism, I was thinking about our Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund that seeks to invest in resilience, and sometimes that means helping to flood-proof like a community. So if FIFRA is able to point to areas of higher, a gradation of levels of hazard and risk, do you see an dynamic kind of evolution over time if we found out that we were successful through a program that tackled flood risk and said, for a community, we've gone to flood proof it? Would we be looking to update kind of these flood maps over time? Because I'm just, maybe that's too hypothetical, but one is hoping that it's not only telling us where we need to not build or to build differently, but also where we can actually prioritize sort of flood proofing community endeavors.
Yeah, great question, Chad. Happy to answer it. And I'll say the one word answer is no, and I'll explain why. And so our federally identified flood risk areas it identifies places based on hazard. So it only uses, for example, the depth and the likelihood of water in those hazard maps to create the ratings. And it does not consider whether your building has been built resilient to a flood construction level of 5 meters or -5 centimeters above the ground surface. So it really just is a hazard-based designation. And any user can take that understanding, which applies to greenfield locations especially, which is quite relevant to infrastructure screening. So you can take that hazard-based rating and you can consider your infrastructure or your asset in that location, and then the real understanding of risk or impact is based on the user's understanding of the exposure. That's a really overly complicated way to say that, I think. But all to say, like, we will be updating the FIFRA data layer based on advancements in our understanding of hazard. So basically where the water will be, how deep and how likely it is to be there. But there's a whole separate part of the actual understanding of risk that is that exposure and the vulnerability components that you're mentioning.
That's very helpful. Thanks. I'm curious about velocity. With that, if there's no other questions just yet, I've learned that from the National Research Council colleagues in the past, that was an interesting or valuable element. Can you speak to that at all?
I definitely can. The understanding of velocity at a Canada-wide scale does not exist, frankly, in a level that is useful to include in this index. The velocity is so hyper dependent on local conditions. So whether that is the flow routing around a building or through a constriction, that it is much less reliable at this point than depth. So it is absolutely important, as is flood duration. There's a significant difference in damage from a flood that you have for 20 minutes in a rainstorm per se versus 2 months in a large fluvial system flood. So that's another really important piece of the puzzle. And we hope we can get there with our input data at this point, but I don't believe we can at this particular moment. And I do also see a couple of hands.
Yes, I see Frank and I see Dan. So we'll turn to Frank first, maybe.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just typed it into the chat because I noticed that you don't look at hands, you look at the chat. So you've answered partially the question, I guess. And when Chad, I had the same question, really. Because when you mentioned you wanted to make this open source, I thought, oh, okay, if this is dynamic and every 5 years we get new flood levels, what does that do to assessments by hazard in flood zones and in other ways? Would that not create the same problem that we have right now, that we have various levels and that they change all the time, and that doesn't give industry and governments any certainty? So my question is, maybe just a confirmation that I put in the chat, is you wanting to make it open source just to integrate into other apps, or is it really for developers to change it as well?
Great question. And one of our real goals with making things open source as we develop that layer is to improve our ability to work with provinces, territories, Indigenous nations, and also start to kind of leverage the emerging area of regional modeling as well. So there's kind of an emerging field of regional modeling that will, I hopefully, bridge the gap between the global modeling work and the local engineering work. And frankly, right now, it's very hard to bridge that gap and connect those data pieces together. And I very much understand the need for certainty in the planning and from some of the end users. But I think the reality that I see when I look at our flood hazard data is that it is changing. Every time we have an upstream development that paves over perhaps a wetland, that changes the downstream flooding. We get constantly improved climate records and precipitation records. We get new data sources in terms of stream gauging. So I think there are some trade-offs for sure between having improvements in accuracy, which require us to iterate and improve our flood data, or using a more static data product that inevitably becomes out of date and is a less accurate option. So ideally, we can actually shape our policy programs to be flexible and to keep taking in all of those improvements in our understanding of flood hazard as we get it. And that actually really also helps make kind of some of those other goals that we have of being multi-hazard resilient as well. We have much better information about flood risk right now that we can action in this type of way than we do, say, wildfires. So it allows us hopefully to get there, but it is really challenging to balance the iteration and the improvements with the kind of static certainty that's needed. But I guess that's true resilient design, adaptable.
But I guess it wouldn't. Then I would, if I can just follow up with the comment, it wouldn't need a change management process to be put in place at the same time. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you.
I just see that we have other people come on screen, and Dan, I see your hand is up, and also a question in the chat from Tang J. But that's really just a point about confirming collaboration with provincial governments, such as Alberta's flood mapping has done quite a bit on flood mapping of the province. I imagine you could affirm the collaboration. Maybe we could turn then to Dan's quote. Dan's hand has gone down, but if there's no, I think, Julie, you were nodding there. So there is collaboration with provincial governments. Like Alberta's done quite a bit of flood mapping. I see Ron Henderson's come on screen. Does that mean, Ron, you'd like to ask a question? We're in last minute here or two of questions.
Oh, I'm just very late to joining the party.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks for joining. It's great to have you here. Okay, well, we're actually now at time for our next speaker. So thank you, Jamie and Julie. We're going to turn in just a moment here to Brian Crosby, who's the Director of Infrastructure Resilience for the British Columbia Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure. And Brian's going to be speaking about system-based approaches for climate resilient infrastructure. He is focused on incorporating resilience into the planning, investment, and maintenance of the provincial transportation system. He also liaises with external partners on emerging issues and partnership opportunities to advance the resilience of BC's infrastructure. Brian has been working in the transportation field since 2011, covering areas such as land management, operations, emergency response, and transportation planning. He holds a bachelor's degree in geography from University of Victoria and a master's degree in urban planning from Queen's University. Prior to his career in transportation, he gained diverse experience in ski hill operations, logging, silviculture, and international education. So Brian, are you okay to share screen? And
sure, I'll see if I can do that here. All right, did that pop up?
Yep, thanks.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Like I said, my name is Brian Crosby. I'm Director of Infrastructure Resilience with the BC Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, and I'm calling to you today from the traditional territory of the Clehé people in Prince George, British Columbia. I'm going to be speaking a little about systems-based approaches to climate resilient infrastructure. This is a project that was completed in partnership with Infrastructure Canada, as well as and drafted by our consultant Arcadis Canada, and we released it earlier this year. There we go. All right, so what is systems thinking? So systems thinking it's really just a way of solving problems by looking at the entire system and examining all those relationships within it. And I think that in and of itself is a pretty simple way of describing it, although deploying any methods to do this, as we found during this project, can be quite difficult and incredibly complex. Another way I like to describe systems thinking to some of my colleagues in the transportation industry is this is a way of looking at a project beyond the road itself or beyond the bridge, up and above in the watershed, down and below in the watershed, and trying to think that your bridge or your asset does not exist independently of the system that it's operating within. And so, when we look at an asset using this lens, we can certainly understand the unpredictable system that it exists, but we also may find some ways of manipulating that system to increase resilience, not just for the asset, but for the entire system itself. So why would this matter to my ministry or the Ministry of Transportation? So obviously the transportation network is a system in itself, and it's interconnected to many other systems, such as just not natural world, but also supply chains, communities, all kinds of different interdependencies and cascading features between all these different systems. And I think the concept of this interconnected transportation network and system really came to the forefront in 2021, where many of us, this was very apparent, but it was largely the first time we started seeing this kind of lens at the leadership level in BC, where our ministers and our executives were talking about the transportation network as a system and the impacts of the 2021 event affecting many things beyond just moving people and goods around the province. So there is that's sort of the genesis of where this project came from was what happened in 2021 in BC. So systems thinking is aligned with a lot of different high level resilience strategies, both globally and nationally and provincially. And some of these strategies are very explicit in their arguments that we should be taking a systems lens to our climate issues, particularly Canada's National Adaptation Strategy, as well as the climate preparedness and adaptation strategy we have here in British Columbia. And then Sendai in and of itself doesn't talk directly about the importance of systems approaches, but the document is inherently speaking about the interconnectedness of all of our systems. And our own strategic plan for BCMOTI references it immediately that we need to be taking a systems lens to our projects. So a little bit about how this fits into what we're sort of calling the MOTI's resilience ecosystem. As you can see it down there in the orange, this was a project that sort of started around 2022 and we released it in 2023, 2024. And it's just sort of another tool that we've developed to help us drive resilience into how our projects are delivered. And we're not stopping there. We're going to be working on concepts of highway criticality and site-specific vulnerability and asset exposure work going into 2025. But this is sort of how it fits into some of our broader projects on resilience and adaptation in MOTI. So as I was saying, this was a project that came out of the 2021 atmospheric river. Specifically, it was a meeting of the deputy ministers of infrastructure in 2022, who gathered in Vancouver to discuss what had just happened, and there was a desire to really dig into how using a systems approach could help us in preparing for the next disaster. And this assignment was picked up by our deputy minister, and she put her hand up and said MOTI would help with this, and we partnered with our friends at Infrastructure Canada to deliver a two-phase project. So phase one was a literature review where we looked at best practices from around the world and in North America and here in Canada as well. And we took that review, and there was a lot of good stuff in there about what is happening globally in this space. However, at the end of the day, it is just a literature review, right? And we're looking for something that provided more of a practical tool set for practitioners who are looking to apply systems approaches or systems thinking in their project. So we started the second phase, which was a guidebook, and we really wanted this guidebook to be generic and applicable to all infrastructure types, not just for linear transportation, but also, vertical or wastewater systems as well. And we wanted it to build upon existing work and feed into and be informed by the resilience ecosystem around it. And we wanted it to provide like just theory as well as worksheets and some practical checklists for how to use systems thinking in your project, be it a small project or even a larger major project. So the guidebook itself it's about 100 pages of material, and I'm not going to run through the whole thing, but a couple interesting features of the guidebook that we put together was we did have a practical example of this guidebook at work, and it sort of cascaded throughout the whole guidebook. So you're able to follow along on this example and how each of the steps was applied to it. So it's a fairly straightforward and easy to read. It's not that chock full of gov speak or other difficult concepts, and because the idea was this could be used by a small municipality all the way up to a large provincial government. And one of the key I think methods in this guidebook is the concept of system mapping and feedback loops, and how systems mapping and the identification and creation of these feedback loops can tie into a climate risk assessment or any other sort of assessment that your organization may be using. So in this case, the systems map is what you see on the left, and it's a series of variables and feedback loops, which are created by what we hope to be a very collaborative team, cross-disciplinary, including people from maybe outside your organization, right? And then what the guidebook does is it provides you some methods to translate that map on the left into something that you might see on the right. This is sort of a common format that you would see in a climate risk assessment. And I think the delta here with this project from a traditional climate risk assessment is it really brings in the concepts of interdependencies, particularly those feedback loops, which I just spoke about. So in a traditional climate risk assessment, you're largely, it's very cause and effect. So it's hazard A impacts asset B, and it gets a score, right? So in this case on the left, you have an individual vulnerability. This is a building, a hospital, and you have a storm, impacts the roof, right? You get a score. What the guidebook does is it brings in the idea of compound vulnerability and interdependencies as identified by those feedback loops. So instead of just having a storm affect a roof, the storm could also affect the electrical system, right, in your hospital. If the electrical system is damaged, that in turn affects the ability of the hospital to service emergency providers and the ability of those emergency providers to bring injured people to the hospital. So there's these systematic dependencies downstream of your initial hazard. And what this does is it actually changes the risk profile of your climate risk. So instead of just having, the individual variables being scored individually, the guidebook provides you a process for bringing those feedback loops and scoring them into your climate risk profile. And that actually substantially changes those risk profiles from something that could be low when you're just considering those individual impacts to something that could be actually quite a lot higher risk when you're considering the downstream impacts of losing that particular asset or infrastructure. So one of our consultants was Dr. Guy Filio, and he's fairly well known. I'm sure probably some of you have come across him in your work. And he took this. He was part of the team, and he was working on another project at the time as well. He decided to apply some of the methods that we developed in this guidebook to this other work he was on, and in a hypothetical fashion. So he created a systems map for a supermarket, right, that was affected by extreme heat. So he mapped out all the interdependencies and variables that were impacted by this supermarket, and then he scored them in a traditional risk fashion. But then he also scored the feedback loops, right, between the different variables, and then that resulted in a completely different risk profile. So which you can see on the right. So some of the earlier risk profiles were indicating that there wasn't a lot of risk for some of this heat, but when you brought in some of those feedback loops and downstream interdependencies, those risks increased substantially. So this was just a hypothetical example, but I think did illustrate well how some of these methods displayed in this guidebook could sort of highlight some of things that you may have overlooked in a traditional climate risk assessment. So what I think makes thinking in systems a little bit different than thinking linearly is allows you to uncover risks and solutions which may not have been initially apparent when you're looking at your asset. Systems mapping is inherently diverse. So you're going to have a stronger systems map, and you're going to have stronger interdependencies with the more people you involve. And so it really moves past that multidisciplinary approach. The guidebook does provide you methods for compounding those vulnerabilities. You can work within your existing workflows. So it is modular. You can plug it into how you're currently doing your risk assessments. And I think largely it does really change the risk profile of your project if you use this method. But there are some challenges to this work. Is, as I said before, systems are very, very complex, and I don't even think that systems mapping can really get around that. We have used this method on another problem. It was not a climate problem. It was a piece of legislation we wanted to change. So we did a systems map exercise around that piece of transportation legislation, and we had probably 200 variables at one point and hundreds of feedback loops throughout, and it got very challenging to wade through that amount of information. And so a lot of this work, because it can be complicated, you're most certainly going to require some sort of facilitation with this work, and that comes with a cost. It's not something like this sort of systems analysis is not really something you can do in an afternoon. It's likely going to require several days of work, numerous workshops if you really want to get it out the door in the proper way. So that in turn, we did say this was scalable, and I do believe that, but you know, you may get more benefit with larger projects that have more resources to bring in some of those experts in facilitation, some subject matter experts as well in climate risk assessments, and in the particular infrastructure that you might be looking at. They also may have the time in a larger project to really dig into systems thinking, right, over several weeks rather than just throwing it out in an afternoon. And unfortunately, the guidebook still remains relatively untested. So despite this being out in the wild for about a year now, even in my own ministry, I've had a hard time finding teams that would want to use this sort of guidebook. They do feel that it's another thing that they're going to have to deploy and spend money on and spend resources. So we did use it in a legislative capacity, but I don't think that really demonstrated the full potential of what it could do. So I'm still looking for a team that wants to use this work. So this is available for everyone. It's free. It's on our adaptation webpage, and you know, the only thing I ask is if you do use it, I'd love to hear about what your results were and if you found it useful or not.
Great.
Any questions?
Well, thanks, Brian. Thank you for sharing that. How important for us all to become more conscious. And I think this is a great audience, a great kind of membership that's intrigued by how we can do ever better on resilience and infrastructure, and the systems thinking certainly is a really important part of that, moving beyond a singular asset, but those services and the nesting of the decisions we make in a much broader context. We're very low on time, and we didn't actually have question period allotted here before we end in 2 to 3 minutes and before I turn it over to Dan. So I'm actually just going to take a moment to say thank you very much to our presenters, Marzia, Jamie, Julie, Brian, for all of the engaging presentations today. You know, we are in a context of wildfires such as those that recently impacted Jasper, and the recent Hurricane Helene. I see 500 miles of destruction is what I'm seeing in the newspapers where millions are affected. So the things that we're tackling in this group are certainly of relevance to our society here and across North America and beyond. A big thank you very much to our membership for turning out today. We have hit 86, which is almost half of our, I think, close to 180 members we have on the membership list now, which is a little bit of a cue for, please remember that we're going to put that membership directory one more time in the chat. Also going to note that December 10th is our next IBWG. It'll be the last of the year 2024. And so again, please do add your name to the IBWG directory. It can help facilitate those connections. Dan, I wanted to offer you a final word. So we're really in the last couple minutes here.
Sure. No, just to say thanks again. Thanks, Marzia and Brian and everyone for the presentations. Brian, you didn't get a chance to have a discussion with the group, but I'm sure there's lots of comments. That's an amazing resource. And if it helps, we're happy to facilitate connections through your privacy program as well. If you're looking for opportunities to apply, it's important to see that resource applied. So thank you for taking the time to present. And just a final reminder, if you have friends, invite them to our meetings, and please do connect with us on topics that you'd like to share or you know of that you would like us to pursue for future meetings. And that's it for me. Thank you again.